Welcome to Innovate, Disrupt, or Die, the podcast where innovation isn't just an ideal, it's a way of life. I'm your host and creator of the Innovate, Disrupt, or Die newsletter, Danny Nathan. Hey, folks, I'm Danny, and welcome back to the Innovate, Disrupt, or Die podcast. On this episode, I have Jason Park, who comes from a really interesting innovation background across a number of different industries, and I'm excited to dive in and learn more. So, Jason, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Danny.
Jason, why don't you start us off and just give us a little bit about your background?
So I live in Cincinnati now, Ohio. I moved here about 4 years ago. I'm originally from California, Southern California, where I grew up. Went to university there, and then I got a job in the gaming industry. Worked for Blizzard Entertainment. Worked on a game called World of Warcraft that I'm sure a lot of people have heard about.
Oh, I'm
And when they
sure.
launched that game, they asked me to go to the Korea office and help them set that up. So I moved to Korea and basically didn't leave Asia for nearly 20 years. So from Korea, I moved to Singapore, did some time in Tokyo, Philippines, and worked across the world. I think I was like a digital nomad before that term kind of came to be.
Before anybody knew what it meant, huh?
So and then I had my own game startup in Singapore. I always wanted to be a game developer. And then I had my studio there. I exited from that and then had my own game publishing startup in Korea with some investors from Tokyo. As I was kind of winding that down, I got contacted by a headhunter who wanted me to check out this role in Singapore for MetLife's innovation lab there. And I'd never heard of innovation as a career before that. Think it was something that someone had just made up, but it sounded interesting. I wanted to go back to Singapore. I'd heard of MetLife because they're a big multinational company. So my thinking was, yeah, I'm going to take the relocation. I'm going to go to Singapore and then, hang out and do this thing for about 2 years and then blow it off. But I ended up staying there for much longer in insurance. And I think it's because we were really working on some interesting things. We were starting East Asia, so Korea, Japan, which are very modern markets, and Bangladesh and India, which are, much more emerging markets. When we're looking at solutions for income protection and protecting people who are just in emerging markets and their challenges. So I found that to be really interesting. So I worked on setting up the first Islamic insurance innovation lab in Malaysia. Did that, and there were a lot of interesting challenges related to Islamic insurance. And then when the pandemic happened, everything just kind of got turned upside down, and I was kind of looking for a new role. They closed the whole office there, so
Oh, wow.
I just landed in Cincinnati, working at Cincinnati Insurance Company, doing something similar, but not in life insurance, but in property and casualty at Cincinnati Insurance Company, which is also fairly large insurance carrier, Fortune 200. A lot of people haven't heard about it, but you might be insured by them.
Gotcha.
And very recently, I would say within the past couple of months, I left Cincinnati Insurance to work on my own startup, working on AI and in the construction industry.
Awesome. All right. There's a lot to unpack in there, Jason. First question for you. Talk to me a little bit about the transition from gaming into an innovation role. I mean, you said that it was your first foray into the world of innovation and you sort of came into it, by happenstance. So what drew you to the role? And then what did you discover about working in the innovation space that kept you in the space for almost 10 years, it looks like?
Yeah, I think, the remit for MetLife's Innovation Lab and Cincinnati was very different, right? And I think that kind of goes to show how, the challenges within innovation could be so broad and different within organizations. I think when I entered MetLife and what really intrigued me about it was, first of all, there was a very charismatic head of that lab. His name was Zia Zaman, he's one of those guys who can sell a fridge to an Eskimo, right? He can sell you on anything. And he sold me on it. And I was like inspired to kind of work at this lab. And I think the difference between Cincinnati and MetLife was that Cincinnati is much more operational. So it's like operational improvement, innovation in, claims technology, underwriting and stuff like that. Whereas in MetLife, I think at the time, people were like, oh, insurance is going to be gone in 5 to 10 years. right? It's going to be completely disrupted. Obviously, that didn't happen, but I think that feeling was quite real back then because there were rumors that Amazon, Google, and these big, tech companies were going to enter the insurance industry, and they're going to have all of this data of all these people, and they're going to be able to undercut the existing carriers using more advanced underwriting methodologies. And I think people were really concerned that they might become like Blockbuster or Kodak or something like that. So what ended up happening was MetLife decided to create this innovation lab and really leverage their core business and not really focus on operational efficiencies or operational innovation. They were like, come and just create a different business that we might be able to go into that's either in the emerging market or within a developing market like Northeast Asia, or we can take, what is our core capabilities, right? It's the ability to, manage a lot of data, be able to understand a lot of factors that kind of affect human life, et cetera, and create a new business around that, right? So that kind of changed as we were helping a lot of these more emerging markets into financial literacy, income protection, and all these things. And we were looking at, a whole different, it was basically, you can do whatever you want as long as it kind of made sense type environment to this PNC carrier, which was more like, how do we shave 2% off of our claims or something like that, right? Which in itself is, nothing wrong with that. It's just two completely different,
Sure.
animals.
Yeah, it sounds like you've had the really unique experience and sort of a divergent experience of working in innovation in an organization that was focused primarily on the creation of new ventures or disruption, as we might call it, versus an organization that is focused on incremental or sustaining innovation and, as you said, sort of aiming for every little bit of efficiency they can achieve. I have so many questions about that. So to start off with, like, talk to me a bit about the process at MetLife where things were more greenfield and opportunistic. And what did that process look like? How did you go about sort of testing, validating ideas, and then bringing them to market? What did it look like for you guys?
So the makeup of that organization was actually very interesting. I think there are about 30 people there, and I would say, a third of them were corporate MetLife folks on some type of rotation program off of their MBA or, just there as working temporarily within the office. Another third were people who had been in innovation for a long time. And like I said, when I met these people, I was fascinated. I was like, what, you work in this thing called innovation? It doesn't make any sense to me. And then the other third were people like me who were entrepreneurs and startup founders. And I always joke innovation labs are where startup founders go to die, or at least take a break until they can figure out what to do next. But
Right. Well
so yeah,
backed paycheck and
it was an interesting dynamic there, right? So I think a lot of the more startup background people were, hit the ground, let's do something, get it running. As whereas the innovation people with innovation backgrounds were like, well, then we need these processes, we need to, be able to form a hypothesis and experiment on it. And I think a lot of the corporate people were just kind of grounding us within the business of insurance, right? So I think other than the more corporate folks, almost none of us really had an insurance background. And I think that was part intentional. You'd be pretty hard pressed to find entrepreneurs, especially back then, who had been in insurtech. I think that term didn't really even exist back then. So for me, it was a learning process. I'd always kind of had that process ingrained in my mind. Like, this is how you build a game. Like you start small, you do some experiments, you create maybe like a pen and paper version of it, and then you kind of see if that mechanism works, and sit around the table and then see what is engaging and what is not before you actually go into actually putting in the production, the development
right.
into it.
Which of course
I
mimics
didn't
closely the development of any startup or business today.
Right. So I was sort of just used to that, but I didn't know the terminology around it. And then I think a lot of innovation labs, especially corporate innovation labs, have, sort of like this multi-vertical thing where it's like one group or one of their focus is to bring that innovation culture within to the organization. And the other one might be to actually develop some ventures or something like that. Right. And MedLife sort of had that as well. Both of the innovation labs had that to some certain extent. Right. So for me, it was a learning experience in that not only am I learning about insurance and fintech, but it's just a lot of these processes that I had just kind of done as a game developer and as a startup owner was now kind of being reintroduced to me with terms and methodologies, which to me was fascinating. I still can't lead those types of sessions. I think when I was at MetLife, I really kind of leaned on them because they did it so well. They're so eloquent, and they can just like put these things together, and then at the end they come up with some board and these ideas and customer profiles and all sorts of things. Whereas I think for us as the entrepreneurial group, we're like, well, let's get the money to do this. What is the budget? How are we going to execute? So it was a very interesting group of people. For me, the whole methodology of getting something from concept to completion was very interesting because a lot of the corporate concepts and then as well as the innovation methodologies were totally new to me.
Jason, how did you go about sort of learning the innovation side of the role, or did they have some sort of like educational mechanism within? Did you just learn by doing? Were you reading books and things on the outside? Like, what was that transition like for you?
It was basically just sink or swim for I think for all of us. We were really learning as we went. I think all of us were very much learning as we went. There was some methodology, but there was also a lot of chaos. Like during the interview process, like they asked me to lead some sessions. So they're like, "Oh, we're doing some innovation sessions in Korea. Can you come and help us lead this thing?" And I'm like, does that mean I'm hired? Like, what's going on here? Like,
Right.
I'm gonna have to spend like half a day like doing this interview process. But I didn't know what I was doing back then. I had never led at anything like that before. So I just went and they're like, okay, this is what we're gonna do. This is what we're gonna map things out, and these are some of the outputs that we expect. And I was like, all right. And then that was my first kind of introduction into it. And then obviously, as I transitioned into that innovation lab, there was a lot of documentation that I could kind of read, and then also kind of shadowing a lot of people. But a lot of times I was just mentoring a lot of startups, working with some of the innovation bootcamp type groups to develop some ideas and stuff like that, as well as execute on some of the projects that.
Interesting. So part of the remit of the innovation lab was to help other startups move forward.
Because of my background with startups and my familiarity with the startup ecosystem in Asia, I work with a lot of startups and just trying to onboard them to MetLife. So we would either identify a startup that I thought was interesting and try and bring them in, or they would be some type of pitch competition that they won, and part of it was to try and do a POC with their product. I think a lot of challenges, especially in insurtech, is because it's so highly regulated, because the corporate culture is just so corporate that a lot of startups, especially if they don't have an insurance background, have a very difficult time navigating. So and I think that role was very similar to what I did at Cincinnati as well, where I worked as my focus was, really on the startup ecosystem and identifying startups and trying to bring those solutions in house. And I think by the time that I was working at Cincinnati, InsurTech had matured dramatically. Right.
Sure.
And I think what's really interesting about InsurTech is that a lot of startups will come from fintech or someplace else.
Mhm.
And while their technology is relevant, it's still different in a lot of ways. So just trying to bridge that gap between the two groups.
So, Jason, I have your LinkedIn profile pulled up here. I mean, it looks like you spent about 5 years at MetLife and then about four at Cincinnati. That's a pretty fair stretch in innovation, especially coming into it raw. Talk to me a little bit about how the transition between the two companies was for you and what some of the major differences were that you saw moving from a greenfield and opportunistic innovation space into, as you described it, a bit more of an incremental focused innovation team.
Right. So I think, when they hired me, and then as I was interviewing people to hire them within the innovation teams, one of the things that we were always kind of trying to identify is one, especially when I was at MetLife, was do they have a bit of an entrepreneurial background, right?
Okay.
And two, do they also have a corporate background, right? And they always kind of wanted both. And that's not easy, but
No, I'd imagine that made your hiring life difficult.
yeah. So for me, I had worked at Samsung Electronics early in my career, and then Blizzard when I joined had like 300 employees. It ballooned up to, a couple thousand, but I wouldn't say they were actually corporate in any way. But I had sort of dealt with this life at Samsung. I had been in Samsung finance as well. And one of the biggest challenges in transitioning was just all the bureaucracy, right? And I think when I first entered, I had, like I said, Zia was there, and then they also had some excellent, executive management who basically kept me from just getting fired because I would just go and do things on my own, right? Like you've given me the budget, so that what else do I need, right? The budget means you green lighting. It's kind of like in a startup, like the VC funds me, so then I'm just going to go do it, right? But that's definitely not the case. Even in an innovation lab, there's still a lot of like steps that you have to take. And a lot of things I was just like, well, you don't need to do this. I'm gonna ignore that. Right. Like IT vendor compliance. Right. I'm like,
Okay.
we're going to create a standalone site. It's not branded MetLife. We're not collecting PII. What's the big deal if I just circumvent this thing that's going to take 2 months, right, to complete? And at the time, it took a really long time, right? I'm like, I just want to get this off the ground. So I would just launch it and just be just like collecting data, and then someone would come to me and be like, "What is this? And why is who's working on this?" Right? And I'm like, "No, I am," right? And basically they're like, "Oh, you can't do that. Like, that's a grounds for being fired." I'm like, I don't know. I thought you guys wanted
Really?
us to move fast and break things, man. Come on, right? But
Right.
yeah, they say that, but that's not exactly what they always want.
And Jason, the situation that you're describing was at MetLife, is that right?
Yeah, man, like,
Got it. Okay. So even the sort of more progressive, get stuff done faster organization still had guardrails that you had to kind of get around and things like that.
yeah.
And did you run into the same sort of guardrails at Cincinnati as well? I mean, how did the two experiences compare?
I think it's very different because at MetLife, a lot of it was trying to develop these new ventures. So a lot of the early experiments just didn't require MetLife's data, right? Didn't require policyholder data or anything like that. Whereas in PNC, if you want to test whether something can improve claims handling by 2 or 3 minutes per claim, then you have to give it a couple of claims, right? So now we have, a couple hundred to a couple thousand claims with all sorts of information that needs to be redacted and stuff like that. And so I think because of the type of projects we were working on, I just felt less of a need. And the fact that I just entered innovation, I think I was a bit more freewheeling back then. But I think as I stayed in corporate innovation for a long time, I started to realize, and what I had known in the past, but also started to reinforce to myself that a lot of these things need to be handled a bit more delicately, right? And then you need to go through the process. And I think the reason MetLife had their innovation lab in Singapore was that MetLife didn't do business in Singapore. So there was no corporate
Oh,
office there
interesting.
to overlord us, right? There was no IT office, there were no compliance people. It was just
Gotcha.
us, right? Whereas here at Cincinnati, I'm sitting in the office with the compliance person, like, 2 offices away. So I think that was the biggest difference, as well as just the type of projects that we were working on.
Gotcha. Um, Jason, having spent 9 years in corporate innovation, what do you think are some of the key elements that enable a company to be successful in their innovation endeavor?
I think that the most successful projects that we were on were the ones where the key decision makers, like the executives on top, were completely bought in, right? Or it's an idea that they kind of brought in, so they're invested in
Right.
it, or it's an idea that you kind of pitch to them to make it seem like it's their idea.
The old ninja move of, no, no, that's great.
So compelling that they're just completely married to the idea. Otherwise, if you don't have that buy-in, I rarely see it succeeding, right? Because nothing ever really seems to happen in the timeline that you want it to happen in. And then there's always
Yes.
many more unexpected obstacles that come up that kind of are roadblocks that sometimes need higher level clearance to kind of clear that up for you, right? And if they're not, if they see it as like a bother, then they're not going to do it. And there's always like personality conflicts within the organization especially between innovation and IT or compliance or someone who is just like complete naysayers and they'll just try and shoot you down whenever they can. Right? I think those internal roadblocks are probably the most difficult to deal with. So the guy with the highest salary just has to be really bought in.
It's interesting, Jason, because I had an interesting conversation with somebody the other day, and we were sort of hinting at the same idea. And ultimately, there is a level of innovation washing that happens within large companies. How do we take the opportunity to tell the world that we are being innovative, regardless of what's actually happening behind the walls? Is that something that, I mean, it sounds like perhaps that's something that you had to contend with a bit and that everybody runs into at some point.
There's all these things like VR and the metaverse and stuff like that. And does that mean that corporate innovators shouldn't experiment with these things? Like, they're a buzzword, but they're a buzzword for a reason, right? And at the very least, you're going to get learnings from it. And I
Mhm.
think, one, you're going to get learnings, and two, you're going to be on top of it, and you're going to be able to assess that after a couple of experiments, like, yeah, this is all hype. There's nothing really behind this. And I think, you know, at MetLife, we did some experiments with VR. This idea did not come from the innovation lab. It came from one of these boot camps. So a bunch of insurance people came up with this idea. So the idea was they're going to have a virtual insurance agent's office, right? And my thinking is, well, first of all, who the heck wants to go into a virtual
Wants to sit in an insurance office.
and secondly, no one has the VR sets yet. So you're going to have to go someplace with it that has one for you to put it on. So then you might just go to an insurance office. And then
Gotcha.
the execution was I don't want to say it was bad, but let's just say that the walls were like flatter than my wall back here. It was like nothing was rendered and nothing. It looked worse than an insurance office, right? And the characters were so poorly animated that you can actually see into the character's mouth and see the hair on the back of her head through her mouth.
Got it.
And
Was this
you know, I,
early days though? I mean, was this
it
the
wasn't that
norm for
early.
VR at the
It wasn't
time?
that early. Yeah,
Okay.
it wasn't that early, right? But our learnings from it is just that. It's like no one is going to put this stuff on and try and replicate a crappy experience. And secondly, if you are going to try and replicate the process of buying an insurance policy and to have all of the freedom of your imagination to execute on it, why would you recreate an insurance office with like a standard looking avatar, the office workers avatar
Right.
across from you,
Yeah.
right?
At
Like,
least let me buy insurance in the Louvre or,
right,
something that's
yeah,
interesting.
exactly. Right? Yeah, like think of something creative, right? As poorly executed as that was, it was a learning experience, right?
Sure. Awesome. Well, Jason, let's shift gears for a moment. Talk to me a bit about what you're doing at Blueprint Crusher, why AI as a technology was such an enabling factor that it inspired you to move on and pursue this, and then I'd also love to learn a bit about how your innovation experience is helping to kind of guide the role that your startup is taking.
So it didn't really make sense until ChatGPT kind of rolled around. And I think early on, one of the first things I was able to identify was just the fact that it could identify differences between two very complex documents, right? So like two policy documents, like I didn't have to be some engineer. I could just be like, here are two documents, what are the difference between these two?
Right.
Right.
You could
And just
ask
kind
in
of like,
plain language and get an answer in
yeah.
plain
And it would
language.
just like spit it out. Whereas in the past, I'd have to send it to like some policy admin, and then like half a day later, if I'm lucky, it would come back, right? So
And you can only imagine that person sitting there with two documents open side by side, literally,
exactly,
you
yeah,
know.
exactly, going line by line, right? So I'm like, well, this has like a bajillion applications, right? Like, well, we can do so many things with this. So when I saw this, I was like, okay, other industries that are less timid and less regulated must have an appetite for this stuff to be able to adopt it at a much faster rate, right?
Sure.
So looking at it, I saw a couple of different ones. Obviously legal and medical comes up a lot, but I'm like, I don't want to deal with medical. That's
No,
basically
that's just as bad as insurance from a
that's
regulatory and
that's the
PII
worst,
perspective.
right? And then yeah, same with legal. So I was like, okay, well, construction seems like something that kind of made sense. I was looking at some of these documents. I'm like, oh, this is like a ton of unstructured data that really can help with AI. So I think in the past, right, and like at the time where I just joined MetLife, I would have been like, okay, I'll build it and they'll come type of thing, right? Whereas I think now I really put a lot of the innovation framework and a lot of, I think, what I consider valuable within some of these innovation practices into it before developing this. And a lot of it was just interviewing people, creating customer profiles, really narrowing down the MVP, working with the POC with construction experts and identifying, what are some of the key things, like really looking into their workflow and identifying like what are some things that these guys are repetitively doing over and over again. We did a lot of homework, I think, before that, before we decided, narrowed down a handful of things that we decided that the MVP would work on, and then obviously have the more grander visions down the pipeline later on.
Interesting. So, talk to me more about how the innovation frameworks that you learned in that space have impacted the way that you're building a new startup. Because as you described earlier, you've built a couple of startups, you've exited one or two, then you had this sort of period of innovation, education, enlightenment, whatever you'd like to call it, and now you're back to the world of startups with all of that experience under your belt. What advice would you give to somebody who is starting their own company, who is looking to build something disruptive that if they hadn't gone through your experience in the innovation space, they might not think of?
Yeah, I think what innovation I think really allowed me to do was to fail without fear, right? Because you're kind of like paid to do that, right? As in, a lot of people don't like to frame it that way. You learn, test and learn and stuff like that. But basically, it's when I stepped back into the startup world, my situation was a little bit different, right? Like when I did it initially, I'm like just a single guy traveling the world. I lived out of my luggage. I could, crash on someone's sofa. Didn't matter if I didn't have any money, and I was just enjoying life. Like I found that to be quite enjoyable. Now that I'm married with two kids and living in this suburb of Ohio, you know, that comes with a price, right? And
Right.
I can't really just kind of jump into it. So it kind of goes back to building that process of being able to analyze the problem, come up with a solution, and develop it to the point where I feel comfortable enough to say, I'm going to take that leap now. Right. And I think my time in innovation has really given me the ability to push that further out. Whereas in the past, I would not even think about the possibility of failure. I would just look at all of the great things I'm going to get once I become a rich tech founder. Right? So I think,
Right.
yeah, and then because I've rinsed and repeated that process so many times with so many different projects, I feel that I kind of understand the mindset. Like, what's the thought process of these people in corporate, right? Like, what's going to convince them to adopt something, and and the most challenging thing is like behavior change, right? So how are you going to get them to move away from what they had been doing for 20, 30 years? Even though it saves them time, they might not feel comfortable changing the way they've been doing it.
Yeah.
So, how do you convince them to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jason, did you start sort of validating and researching the opportunity around construction prior to leaving Cincinnati? Were you sort of eyeballing this space and trying to figure out where you wanted to go and how to get into it?
So I think because of my background in the startup ecosystem and then my connection with a lot of people within the startup scene and just like all my friends are kind of from that space, right? Technology space. So I'm always in these Telegram groups and Facebook, whatever. And we're always kind of throwing ideas around, right? So I want to say like I sat there and studied this construction space, but I've always been looking at different things, right? And just seeing what opportunities are there. That's one of the culture shocks that I have from moving to the Midwest is that everyone just talks about sports and their lawn, right? And like, I'm not used to that. Like when I hang out with my
Right.
friends, yeah, I just talk about technology and startups and what's going on with Elon Musk or Bitcoin or something that I saw at some conference that I thought was fascinating or something that didn't succeed, but I think if you did it a little bit differently, it could succeed. Or if you apply to a different industry, that's all we talk about. Right? And like, that's what we
Right.
geek out because I'm a total nerd, right? So So I like tinkering in the background while I'm working at the company to do this. I think that's always kind of where my mind has been. And I think that's sort of part of my job as well. It's like, what's working in this industry that I can bring to insurance, right? I'm always kind of looking to see what's out there and what can be brought back or repurposed. And so because we also do lots of construction insurance policies, I'm always kind of looking at technology in construction.
Awesome. Uh, Last couple of questions here, Jason. Do you have any favorite books, newsletters, websites, resources that you use to keep up with what's happening in the innovation space or in the world of technology so that you can discover things that you might be able to apply to other areas?
Oh man, this is like the answer that you should probably edit out. Basically, no. So, a couple of years ago, I just told myself, like, I'm not going to read any more nonfiction, right?
No worries. No worries at all. Jason, is there anything that we missed that you're dying to share? Anything that I should have asked but didn't?
No, not really. I'm just really excited about my startup. We just got our pre-seed round,
Oh,
raised
wow.
it.
Congrats.
Yeah, just got signed the term sheet yesterday. I got it back. So now, oddly enough, I got the investment from a VC in Finland. So I need to fly out to Helsinki to meet some people and do a couple of things. My co-founder is Irish. So we met in Korea maybe almost 20 years ago. We met a long time ago. We were actually sharing the same co-working space with my game company. And then I got to know him as a friend. And he's the one who actually sort of brought this construction problem, to me. And we talked about it maybe for a year or longer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
During the pandemic, he was living in Korea, and then during the pandemic, I ended up moving to Cincinnati. He ended up moving back to Ireland. So because he's Irish, we had access to a lot of the European VCs that I think a lot of American startups probably don't really think too much about. So we initially, I think for the pre-seed round, just hit up only local VCs. So I talked to a couple here in Ohio, and then we were talking to a couple in Ireland, and then I think quite randomly we just discovered this. The Finland is pretty famous for architecture and bringing it to construction and stuff like that. So we found someone that was a good fit. So we just closed the pre-seed round with them.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. And I'm jealous. I've never been to Finland, but it sounds like fun. Jason, where can our listeners find you if they want to learn more about your startup and what you're up to or connect with you to talk more about what we've been chatting about?
Yeah, my startup, it's blueprintcrusher.com. It's pretty easy to remember. I've worked with a lot of startups, and I always said, I'm not going to give it some goofy name where you forget about it or confuse it with every other one. I'm going to be like exactly what it does. It's going to
Yeah.
crush Blueprint. So blueprintcrusher.com. And
Well, Jason, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely fantastic to learn about your background and your journey through the world of innovation. So I really appreciate you sitting down with me.
really appreciate it. It was a good time. Thanks, Danny.
That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in to Innovate, Disrupt, or Die, the podcast. Join us again for our next episode, and don't forget to subscribe at innovatedisruptordie.com. That's all, folks.